Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, February 25th, 2026, and our dear friend Scott Ritter is here with us. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Please hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And Scott, I think it's relevant to start with what Donald Trump said and with his speech at the State of Union. And considering the foreign policy of the United States when it comes to the war in Ukraine, he said something like, 15 seconds. He talked about the Russia and Ukraine, then something like 1 minute about Iran, not much about China. What is the understanding, in your opinion, of this speech on the part of how does Russia, for example, see the foreign policy of Donald Trump?
Well, I think first of all, we have to understand what this speech was about. This is a speech for a domestic American audience. It wasn't the platform he uses to communicate with foreign leaders. Um, and so, and now we get into what I believe is the arrogance of Donald Trump. He's not seeking permission from the American people to do anything in the foreign policy sphere. He's not asking for their permission. He's not trying to sell them anything. He will do what he wants to do when he wants to do it. And remember, he's addressing Congress. He's not asking Congress for permission. He's basically has said Congress simply doesn't matter on issues pertaining to foreign policy. So that's why we got so little. People who are expecting him to get up at the State of the Union and declare war against Iran or lay out some detailed plan, no. It's not the right forum for that. This is not your average American president. This is a man who has stated that he functions more as a dictator. We saw evidence of the fact that his government is little more than a cult of personality, the cult of Donald Trump. And we saw that he doesn't care for the American Constitution. He doesn't care for the checks and balances. He doesn't care for the warnings that were given to all Americans when the Constitution was being debated. Again, I just encourage everybody to go out and read the Federalist Papers. Read two in particular. Read Federalist 10, James Madison, and read Federalist 51, James Madison. Federalist 10 talks about the dangers of factionalism, where the country gets divided into factions that are overcome with emotions, and they're not thinking about what's best for the country, the collective. They're thinking what's best for themselves, their faction. And the notion of a large republic was supposed to offset the danger of factions. This is the argument that Madison was making. And the best way to form a large republic is to have a constitutional republic, therefore the necessity of a constitution. Federalist 51 spoke about the necessity of checks and balances to prevent the accumulation of power in the hands of an executive from transforming what was supposed to be, a constitutional republic into a tyranny. Checks and balances means that we have three separate but equal branches of government. What you saw on display at the State of the Union wasn't three separate but equal branches of government. You saw the president openly mocking the Supreme Court of the United States, basically telling them that their ruling just doesn't matter. He's going to do what he wants to do. And there's nothing they can do to stop him because they have no army, no police force, no nothing. They can pass, we can do a finding here, and we can, make a case here and a judgment here and a ruling there. But unless there's the mechanism of enforcement, it's useless. And the mechanism of enforcement is, of course, the Congress of the United States. That, again, part of Federalist 51 says that the idea of giving each branch significant power was to ensure that they would fight to make sure no other branch took their power. So the idea is that Congress is supposed to fight to preserve the prerogatives of Congress. And one of the prerogatives of Congress is to make sure the president doesn't nullify the judiciary by ignoring the law. And you do that through impeachment. It's amazing what happens if you start threatening to impeach a president for violating the Constitution. But Congress doesn't function as a Congress, a singularity. Congress has now been turned into a collection of factions that fight amongst themselves. And we saw that on display. The whole thing about standing up, sitting down, shame on you. He mocked the Democrats, called them un-American, called them everything possible. And so when we have a president that behaves in this manner, why do you think he's going to explain anything to you, to us, to we the people? He's certainly not going to be asking for permission from Congress. He's just going to do it. And so what we saw up there was, ego-driven narcissism. The Trump Act. I didn't name it that. Don't blame me. I didn't name it the Trump. They named it the Trump thing because they're good people, which means they know who the boss is, who's responsible. That's what it was. So somebody asked me a question. I did a panel on Al Mayadeen afterwards, and they asked, the speech went on and on and on and on. Do I feel that there was a display of confidence by the president or something? I said, no, the man giving that speech is not a confident man. Abraham Lincoln was a confident man. Read his Gettysburg Address, the brevity of it, and yet the gravitas that was attached to that statement, that speech made by a confident man. When you have somebody up there just blabbering and blabbering and blabbering and blabbering and blabbering, they're not confident. They're up there posturing because it's all about him and the need to be seen as being bigger than life, better than life. And that was what was on display. I basically call it the death of America. It wasn't a State of the Union address. It was a State of the Donald address. And the state of the Donald's not very good right now.
We had Chuck Schumer saying that what's going on between the United States and Iran is a serious issue that should be discussed. But as you mentioned, but he wanted Donald Trump. Actually, before the speech, he said that. He said, we want to hear from the president of the United States, but he didn't mention that much. It's not just us from outside. It's about Chuck Schumer, the leader of the minority.
He's the leader of a faction. He's not the leader of a minority government because we don't function as a government anymore. He's the leader of a minority faction. Therefore, he's irrelevant. That's one of the dangers of factionalism, is that it's us versus them 100% down the line, as opposed to people working together. We may have different political opinions, but we recognize the singularity of Congress and the necessity of working together, in a government that has three separate but equal branches. Then Chuck Schumer's words resonate. They matter. He's a senator, after all, in Congress. But right now he's just a faction leader. Trump doesn't care about the other faction. It's irrelevant. Doesn't matter. What does Chuck Schumer want? He's as guilty as anybody else in creating this factionalism. This isn't a one-way street. Donald Trump didn't invent this yesterday. He's just coming in and he took a diseased system and he's taken it to its logical conclusion because, a long time ago, Congress stopped working for the presidency and parties started working for presidents of their political party. So that's the beginning of factionalism. The only thing that holds the republic together is the notion of the difference, the distinction between Congress and the presidency, where Congress still said, we matter. Today, Congress doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. They just do, the Republicans, the faction, do what the president, the cult leader tells them to do. So who cares what Chuck Schumer said? President didn't. Congress, the Republicans don't. And frankly speaking, the American people don't either, because that's one of the dangers of factionalism is we just tend to plug out. When you're not representing we the people, when you're representing a faction, a cause, an ideology, I don't really care what you think anymore, especially if I'm not in your faction.
No. Scott, when it comes to the conflict with Iran, finally we've heard something from Pentagon, because I remember during the Biden administration how Pentagon was effective in that meeting between Donald Trump, Starmer went to Washington, talked with Joe Biden. He wanted to send long-range missiles to Ukraine to hit Russia deep inside Russian territory, which was rejected by Pentagon. And finally, we are hearing from. I was surprised that Pentagon there's doing something like this under the Trump administration. And he said that General Kane said that is the war with Iran is not going to be a quick war. It's going to be a long and costly war for the United States. And Donald Trump immediately after that came out and said, "I know he tried to somehow, shape the things the way that he wants to be seen in terms of the conflict. He didn't want it to these sort of comments coming out, and he said that the general is completely agreeing that if you start the war, we're gonna achieve victory and we're gonna win this war, and all of that. How do you see the Trump administration in terms of, because the war in the Middle East, we have to accept is not a simple and is not a little issue. It's a huge issue because the United States has been involved in the Middle East for many, many years in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and right now with Iran. It's a huge issue for American people, not only for the President of the United States. What is happening in your opinion?
Well, first of all, the Pentagon hasn't said anything. Find me an official Pentagon statement, Pentagon letterhead, Secretary of War, somebody, give me a name. Who in the Pentagon said what? And we don't have a name. So the Pentagon hasn't said anything. We have media outlets that are quoting unnamed sources within ostensibly the Pentagon. But we don't know. We don't know if we know. I'll tell you what, I know that the Wall Street Journal has made up stories in the past. We know this. And we know that the Washington Post has made up stories in the past too, just manufactured out of thin air. So I'm a little hesitant when the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal start coming out with something like this. I'd like to believe it's true because it's the only way we stop this war.
It came out in Axios, but Axios is the same as it doesn't change the reality. Yeah,
you're not building up my confidence
exactly
in the story.
Yeah.
You actually took it down a notch. But the if it's true, this would be troublesome. First of all, you got to understand how the Pentagon works. I can't speak for the present day Pentagon. I don't work there. I don't know anybody there. But I've seen, people operating at the Joint Chiefs of Staff level. And I see how they talk. Their job isn't to make policy. They just provide, solutions to policy problems. They don't run around and say, we have to go to war against Iran. They simply say, what's the mission? What do you want us to accomplish it? And then we will look at our force structure and tell you what we need to make this happen. Now, they can say, if your objective is a quick war that achieves X, Y, and Z, we don't believe that the force structure is capable of reaching that conclusion. We're afraid that if we start, we may run out of ammunition before we run out of targets. That's a problem. And we may not be able to suppress the totality of Iran's capabilities with the forces that have been allocated to the task. That's not saying you can't go to war, Mr. President. That's not saying we don't want to go to war. It's simply saying that we have a resource problem and it could lead to other problems. And we have to put you on notice because the military's job, again, isn't to make policy, it's to implement policy. But they're professionals. So if they're told to accomplish something within the following parameters, they don't have the force structure capable of accomplishing that. They have a professionally and they're duty bound to tell the president that. And so what happens is you get a statement, and I'm fairly certain, basically the Air Force, looking at the target deck, looked at the available ammunition and went, we're going to run out of bombs before we run out of targets. If our job is to suppress, we know, historically speaking, and we can project, what the bomb expenditure rate is, et cetera, we're going to run out of bombs. Remember, we gave the Israelis a whole bunch of bombs, and they dropped them all on Gaza. How do you think Gaza got to look the way it did? Well, thanks to the American bomb, which we don't have that many anymore because we gave them all to Israel. Thanks, Israel. Iran should send a thank you letter to Israel. I'm joking because, of course, Iran will never do anything to sustain or mock the crimes of genocide that Israel's, waged against Gaza and the other neighbors. But my point is, Israel has drained the ability of the United States to, wage a conflict. Cruise missiles. We have a finite number of cruise missiles. And we don't have enough to match the targets. And so then what happens is you get into a race against the clock in terms of regime change, because I believe that's the goal, that's the objective. The Air Force is supposed to suppress Iran's ballistic missile launch capabilities, while other air power decapitates the leadership, sows chaos by disrupting communications, and suppresses the regime's ability to mobilize security forces to put down unrest. And the goal is to achieve the collapse of the regime and the empowerment of an alternative government that will then stop firing missiles. So it's a race against the clock. And I think the CIA has sold the president a bill of goods based upon certain assessments that they're making. It's curious what's going on in Iran right now. Again, I don't like to read into things I don't know too much about in terms of the background. But, the CIA has reached out with, we hear you. This is how you can get in touch with us kind of thing. It's almost an act of desperation on the part of an organization that appears to have lost contact with a lot of its embedded resources, which implies that the Iranian security services might be better than people originally thought. And if that's the case, again, regime change becomes a much more difficult task and impossible if we run out of bombs. So I think the military is saying we can't guarantee an outcome. And here's the problem. No president can survive going to war, a war of choice where there is no cognizable imminent threat to the United States, and then lose, or get in a situation where we lose American lives, or get in a situation where Israel gets turned upside down, or, we can go on and on and on. This would be politically devastating for this president. I think one of the things that makes this war attractive is that, he was told that he could achieve in, 7 to 12 days, maybe a little bit longer, regime change. And that this could be done without putting boots on the ground, and it can be done, with minimal loss of life and materiel. And he believed that if he could accomplish regime change under those conditions, he would be the greatest president in the history of the United States, having accomplished something that nobody else. Because remember, he's Donald Trump. World War II, nothing. Big nothing burger, not a big deal. World War I, don't worry about it. I'm better. I'm Donald Trump. And so, he wants to sell himself as the best thing since sliced bread. But you can only do that if you win. That message doesn't, that dog don't hunt if you didn't win the war, especially if you lost the war, or equally as bad, it's a long drawn out affair, meaning we are unable to suppress. We have to go into a containment mode. And next thing you know, we're looking at a very long war with doing a lot of damage to the global economy on the lead of midterm elections. So I think that's why the military is doing what they're doing. But again, the military's job is to, carry out the mission. Nobody in the military, you didn't read anywhere in those articles any general saying, I question the legality of your orders. None of them said, where's the Security Council resolution of the United Nations? None of them said, where's the congressional authorization? All they said is, we may not have enough bombs. So,
How much of what the American people are thinking of a new war in the Middle East is important for the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself? Because, as you know, the new polls, putting all of them together, between 15 to 25% of Americans agreeing on a new war in the Middle East. And the opposite has 75%, 70% of the people say no to war. And Donald Trump himself was elected on the basis on a platform of peace and focusing on the United States, not bringing up new wars. How much of that is important for him?
well, I think he's making a gamble that says if I win this war quickly, all the naysayers will have been proven wrong. And then you'll see the numbers change. Remember, George Herbert Walker Bush, going into Operation Desert Storm, didn't have a groundswell of support amongst the American population. In fact, in the fall of 1990, when this war was being sold based upon the need to, defend Saudi Arabian oil from, Iraqi, effort to seize the eastern oil fields, the overwhelming sentiment amongst the American people is no war for oil. Remember, we're just about 17 years removed from the Vietnam War. Many of the people still that were serving at the time served in Vietnam. And the psychology of the American people, wasn't conducive to get involved in yet another Middle East Vietnam. No war for oil, no war for oil. That's why, H.W. gave his speech in Cleveland where he linked Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler to change the narrative of the fight. But when we won Desert Storm, because remember, when we won, we had parades in the streets. Schwarzkopf marching down, Central Avenue in New York, Broadway in New York City, ticker tape parade. We didn't come to face. We hadn't yet confronted the reality that Saddam was in power. This was problematic, and it would, our inability to remove Saddam would resonate, decades later. We had won, and there was no more political problem as far as George H.W. Bush was concerned about the decision to go to war because we won convincingly, at least according to the propagandists. And I think Donald Trump is looking at the same thing, saying, I know they're against it now, but if I deliver a very, very quick victory, unprecedented victory that then, secures Israel and compels the Gulf Arab states to embrace the Abrams Accord, et cetera, I'm the conquering hero. And the American people will rally around me. And he's probably right, because the American people are, by and large, very simplistic people. And, monkey see, monkey do. You saw Congress last night, the Republican faction break out in the USA chant. Very childlike, totally unbecoming for Congress, but there is no respect anymore for the institution of Congress or anything else. They're factions. That's all they are, political factions. But, if Trump won the war against Iran, I can guarantee you the streets of Washington, D.C. would be filled with people going, USA, USA. A scene, on a larger scale than what happened when Osama bin Laden was announced to be killed. Remember the spontaneous crowd outside the White House, USA, USA. Because we've turned war into a sporting event, and we don't differentiate between cheering on the American military and cheering on, Champions League soccer club or an NFL team or your favorite NASCAR driver. So I think this is the thinking of Donald Trump in this regard. He thinks a quick war solves everything. There will be no problems. And he's right, to be honest. If he went in and in 12 days after the conflict, the regime was gone and the missiles were suppressed, and, he would be one of the most popular presidents at that moment in history, because Americans are simplistic people, and we would have rallied around the victory.
But that could, I would say that could have happened in June 2025, not now, because now the two sides are so much prepared for the Americans are prepared, Iranians are prepared, and we know that Iran is not alone, and at least not physically, but they are connected with Russians and Chinese, and they know what at stake for Iran. And I would say in the initial moments of the attack, if the United States decides to attack Iran would know that the attack is coming and they're gonna respond, and it could be some sort of disaster. And I don't know how much of that argument. Who are these people that are arguing that by a quick war, they can achieve something? Are they really people who have experience in that sort that can prove that, or they're just making based on some ideology? Because I teach at university, you know that it's different when you teach and you work in the same field. And since I do the both, I know what is the difference. It's totally different, ideologically. When you go with war and you have the experience of doing something, it's totally different. And who are these people? How much of experience do they have, in your opinion?
Again, we have to be careful not to conflate fantasy with reality. The political thinking of the positive consequences of a quick war with Iran is thinking done in a vacuum, devoid of reality, devoid of any other input, just the basic causal relationship between a quick victory and political support in the United States. What you're talking about is injecting reality, but that reality won't become manifest until after the conflict starts. And by then it's too late. What we're talking about right now is what the thinking would be in terms of Donald Trump pulling the trigger. But once you pull the trigger, all bets are off. No plan survives initial contact with the enemy, and the enemy always has a vote. I would caution people, though, not to focus exclusively on the military. First of all, I'm reading things that say, Iran may have gotten the Su-35 already. How many flight hours does that Iranian pilot have in that aircraft? Has he taken it through complex combat maneuvering? Has he trained in a realistic warlike scenario? Does he have any combat experience in the Su-35? The answer is no, 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 no. He's going up against American pilots who have trained extensively and almost exclusively on doing what they're getting ready to do. Notice that none of the Pentagon people, according to the leaks, said, we can't do this. They didn't say that. They said, we don't have enough bombs to keep doing this. They didn't say, oh, we can't do this. We're not going to be able to do it. Because I'm here to tell you right now that if we had enough bombs, we might be able to do it. We're that good. I just, again, people, Scott Ritter's put out his war mongering. I don't really give a rat's ass what people think. I know what the hell I'm talking about. There's a difference between a declining superpower in terms of the overall impact that our, collective of, political, economic, and military power brings to the table. Everybody knows that we're in a world in transition, that this isn't the world that was 20 years ago. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about Iran, a nation that has been subject to stringent economic sanctions for decades, whose economy is weak, whose military has poured a lot of resources into certain things like ballistic missiles and acquiring other technology, but isn't a combat hardened force throughout. They don't have a wealth of relevant modern day combat experience. They have zero combat experience against an enemy like the United States with what we're getting ready to bring to bear. And so I would just caution people that while, yes, Iran is a very proud nation, et cetera, there's a reason why military professionals are cocky. Just to give you an example of, when we were preparing to go to war against Iraq in 1990, we were painting the Iraqis to be 10 foot tall. I remember going to brief. I mean, one of my famous moments in life, I was I did up an amphibious assault plan to insert a multi-division size force into the Al Peninsula, and then it would then come up and swing across and threaten the Al Zubair logistics area. In doing so, the Republican Guard, the Medina, Tawakana, and can't remember the third division, who were dug in, would have to pivot and counterattack. But in moving, they would expose themselves to interdiction by air power. And the idea was that we would destroy them while taking Zubair, destabilize, and achieve a relatively quick victory. Sort of the Marine Corps version of what we were doing, more direct action, because we don't like to just avoid fights. We like to dive right into them. But this was staffed at the major general, lieutenant general level, and then it was supposed to be briefed to the commandant of the Marine Corps, 4 stars, along with the assistant commandant and all the other 4 stars, and most of the 3 stars in the Marine Corps were at this briefing. I had written the briefing. It was my plan, but they decided that a colonel would give the briefing. But since I knew the plan and I was, had written it, on the slides that I made, I would be able to, as the conversation went, know exactly which slide to put up. So there would be no hesitation. If a question was asked, the right slide would be there. If the briefing wanted to make a point, the right slide would be there. Boom, 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 boom. So I'm out there and I'm doing all this. But before I went in there, the colonel who ran the Marine Corps intelligence activity pulled me aside and he said, because my whole briefing was based upon the notion that if we took out Iraqi command and control and we shocked the Iraqi forces, that they would break. And this was an experience from the Iran-Iraq War. The Iranians knew that if you suppressed Iraqi leadership and subjected Iraqi forces to a shock, they tended to break down and retreat. That's why you have so many prisoners, because there'd be a breakdown. If the command and control stayed in place, the Iraqis fought like son of a guns. But if you could break down the command and control and create hesitation, you'd be able to move in and achieve results. I said, we will be able to do that. And I sold that to Major General Caulfield. But the colonel said, when you do the briefing, don't say a word. If you're asked a question, don't answer the question. Just say you don't know and move on. And I was like, well, I don't work for you. But yes, sir. And so I'm in there and I'm flipping the slides. And General Gray, Al Gray, the commandant, says he's asking questions, and I'm flipping the slides. And finally looks over and he goes, I'm asking questions to these guys, but I think I'm asking questions to the wrong person. He said, I'm watching you. I think you're more than just a captain flipping slides. I think you wrote this plan. I think this is your plan. Am I right? And I looked at the colonel, the SEAL who was giving the briefing. He's like, yeah, yes, sir. He goes, okay, so I'm going to ask you, what do you think of the plans of success? And I said, the Iraqis aren't 10 feet tall, that if we shock their command and control and we hit them with a mailed fist like this, I said, they'll chew hoi, which is a Vietnam word, hands up, surrender, run. And I said, my guess is that we will spend far more time processing Iraqi prisoners of war than we will killing Iraqis. Turned out to be 100% correct. I got yelled at by the colonel afterwards. But my point is, the military is very conservative. They don't go in for wild ass, speculative things. You don't commit that many forces. I had done another plan to insert a reinforced LAV company to do a raid. And I remember one of the helicopter pilots that was advising Colonel Seifert, he flew a helicopter during the Desert One rescue mission. And that didn't go well. And he stood up and he said, we shouldn't be doing this because we have, problem is, we don't get enough helicopters. We have Marines trapped, da, da, da. And when you have somebody of his stature raise a question like that, you can't go forward with the mission because, God forbid, we don't have enough helicopters and Marines die. The people that signed off on it are in a lot of trouble. If you can't respond by saying, no, we have sufficient helicopters to make up for the deficiency, we have a backup plan, all this stuff, it doesn't go down. So that mission got thrown out. And the reason why I bring this up is that there's no one right now saying we can't do that. We can't accomplish that, which tells you something, because these aren't amateurs. These are people who have studied the threat, who have very good intelligence, technical intelligence. I mean, we can sit here and go, the Su-35, this, that, and the other thing. I could probably guarantee that the basic blueprints of the Su-35 are in the hands of the United States with all the performance characteristics, and that when we do the top secret simulations in Nevada, our pilots are going up against F-16s, et cetera, that have been programmed to accurately replicate the performance standards of these planes. So we're not going in based upon speculative chest thumping. We're going in because we have studied the problem, and there's a confidence that we can suppress the Iranian ballistic missiles. There's a confidence we can shut down their radars. There's a confidence we can suppress their air defense. There's a confidence we'll be able to strike the targets we want to strike. The generals aren't saying we can't do this. They're saying we don't have enough ammunition to do this. Two different arguments. And so I just think that, there's no guarantee. Just because we think we can do something doesn't mean we're going to be able to do it either. Because the Iranians are professionals as well. And they're preparing. They've been studying the United States for a long time. For all the Americans out there that poo-poo Iranian capability, Google the Beast of Kandahar. RQ-76 or 176, I don't know. Can't remember. The giant B-2 looking, stealth drone. And how the Iranians stole it. How did they steal it? By monitoring the Beast of Kandahar taking off from Kandahar, then doing the top secret handshake to transfer control of the aircraft from ground controllers in Kandahar to controllers operating via satellite link from Nevada. It's highly encrypted. There might be other mechanisms involved to secure. The Iranians monitored it and were able to break in and take control of the drone and land it and own it. Ask the Israelis about in 2006, the Iranian SIGINT units that broke into their frequency hopping tactical radios. Frequency hopping means you've got an encrypted signal, so it's already problems. But instead of just communicating on the one line, it's jumping around different frequencies, hopping back and forth. And if you don't know the key, all you hear is shh as it hops around because you can't lock in on the frequency in time. And if you can, it's usually done later when you've collected it, you run it through a supercomputer and you're able to, get it all in, but it's too late. The battle's over. The Iranians were able to assist Hezbollah by breaking into these comms real time. And then they had SIGINT operators who spoke Hebrew perfectly and were trained to mimic. And so they broke in and they were able to use Hebrew language, using code words and speaking in a way that mimicked the people. And they gave code words to initiate, phase alpha, Apple. And Sayed Matkal, the elite special forces of Israel, launched an attack straight into a Hezbollah ambush. That just doesn't happen, guys. It happens because the Iranians are pretty damn good at what they do, and that has to be respected as well. And the fact that I'm saying this means the U.S. military knows this, which means somewhere there's an analyst like Scott Ritter saying this is what the Iranians are capable of doing. And yet we still are confident enough to say, no, we got this. We just don't have enough bombs. And I bring this up because I don't think the press reports are saying what the generals are saying. The press reports are saying what the reporters want the generals to be saying. But I think what the generals are saying is we can kick Iran's ass. We just don't have enough bombs to keep kicking their ass. And when we run out of bombs, then Iran will be able to hurt us and drag us into a long fight. It's a sustainability issue, not a performance issue.
Isn't that the same in Ukraine? Because they when they started the war in Ukraine, they thought that they're gonna bring Russia down. They're gonna do regime change in Russia. The same, Scott. It seems that everything is just repeating in my mind. And if you go,
the thing is, Russian,
you remember what they were talking about the Russian army in those days? It's a defensive army. They don't have the battlefield, experience. They don't know what to do. But as time went by, we saw how the Russians are advancing and getting better and better. These are the nature of the wars.
They adapted.
Yeah.
But the Ukrainians got better and better too. Someday the true story of the first months of that war will be published. The Russian army, yes, I mean, again, a story from a former fighter of the Donbass militias who, was a veteran and went on to become a reporter. He told me about how when the SMO began, he, contacted all of his buddies, from the militias saying, stand down, watch this. The adults are coming in. Watch what they do. And then he watched the Russian army come in. He went, they don't have any idea what they're doing. They're making huge mistakes. You can't, go into an urban environment the way they're going in. You can't, project power without flank security. You're going to get ambushed. And sure enough, ambushes, death, destruction. And he called the guys up and goes, we got to get back engaged. We got to start talking to the Russians about reality. The Russians performed not the greatest way. And a lot of people pick up on that and say, well, the Russians suck. The Russians destroyed the Ukrainian army. People tend to forget that point, that from the time they invaded until April, they had destroyed the bulk of the Ukrainian army. It was only when we injected $48 billion and there was emergency mobilization of territorial forces, et cetera. Remember, back then, they didn't have guys running around beating people on the head. They actually had trained reserves. And they brought these reserves in, organized them, got them equipment, and shoved them into the line. And you combine that with the fact that the Russians had agreed to confidence-building measures in accordance to the Istanbul Communique, which had the Russians withdrawing voluntarily from territories. And in the Kharkov region, the First Guards Tank Army, over 50% of it was already back on Russian soil refitting. So when the new Ukrainian army counterattacked, there wasn't anybody to block them, and they used tactics that broke through the gaps, got 20 kilometers deep, and forced the Russians to withdraw. But then the Russians mobilized 300,000 men. General Surovikin came in, graded the Surovikin line. General Romanov was sent to the General Staff Academy and rewrote the defensive manual, came back, built the defenses outside of Tokmak, the Robotyno, right where Zaluzhny said the main counterattack of 2023 was going to be, and the Russians crushed the counterattack. And since that time, the Russians have been adapting and moving on. But at no time did the Russians come in with anything like what we're ready to go into Iran with. The Russians didn't go in with a war-winning posture or strategy. I mean, we're talking, 90 to 100,000 troops going up against a Ukrainian force that outnumbered it 4-1. You don't do that unless they were trying to achieve the occupation of big cities. They didn't have enough troops. They were trying to compel the Ukrainian government to go into negotiations, which they succeeded in doing. 3 rounds of negotiations in Gomel, 2 additional rounds in Turkey, culminating in a nearly completed peace deal that Boris Johnson came in and scuttled. But that's what the Russians were doing. We can't sit there and say, do a comparative analysis saying, oh, we got it all wrong. Everybody got it wrong about the Russians because nobody understood what the Russians were up to. Even the Russians didn't understand what the Russians were up to, I think. I mean, I think some people knew what they were doing, but, it was just not enough troops. And then it took I mean, the whole thing about Wagner, Wagner was a stopgap measure. Wagner wasn't supposed to exist. Wagner was created in May of 2022, after the decision was made that the Ukrainians weren't going to surrender. Now they have to take the Donbass, but they didn't have sufficient troops. So Wagner was created to assist the militias of the Donbass, of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Army. The Russians are, reacting, cobbling things together. It was very much a reactive battle plan. It wasn't a well thought out battle plan with plan A, plan B, plan C. Plan B was, damn it, we didn't get them to surrender or agree to peace terms. So now we have to fight. So we're going to take the Donbass and we're going to create Wagner to do it because we have a legal problem. We're not legally allowed to deploy the Russian army on the territories of Lugansk and Donetsk. But this is where the bulk of the fighting needs to take place. So you just can't make a direct comparison between what happened between Russia and Ukraine and what could happen between the United States and Iran. But, you are right. The Russian army has adapted. But even to this day, they're not fighting a war. I just want people to understand that. If they were fighting a war, there wouldn't have been a wreath-laying ceremony in Kiev where all of the European leaders got together at one point. Because if we're fighting a war, they'd all be dead. An Oreshnik missile would have hit that spot, 10 minutes after launch. Zelensky would be long dead, Budanov dead, Zaluzhny dead. But the Russians aren't killing the senior leadership. The Russians, how come people can still show up in Kiev rail station? Why is there a Kiev rail station? Because if this was a war, it wouldn't exist. Bankova wouldn't exist. The president's administration wouldn't exist. But it's not a war. It's a special military operation that's become more complex and more violent and operates on a more massive scale. But it's not a war. That's the last thing it is. It's warlike, but it's not a war. It's a special military operation. There's a lot of weird stuff going on in this conflict that makes it hard to explain sometimes what's really going on, because there's so much politics involved in this conflict.
But Ukraine is unique, in my opinion, because it provided some sort of battleground for all sides to learn from. I would argue we've seen the North Korean soldiers being in the Kursk region. I would argue the Chinese and Iranians. I have seen many videos in which you hear the Persian language, they're talking Russian videos that you hear that there are soldiers, amongst soldiers, Iranians who are talking in Persians and in Persian. And how much of, we had some sort of collaboration, how much of what has happened in Ukraine would improve the Iranian position, would give them some sort of understanding of the battleground. You've mentioned, let's assume that the United States attacks Iran with fighter jets. Is that enough for an operation? Because the situation going to be totally different, and they're going to get hit. It's not just only the United States attacking Iran. It's going to be both sides attacking each other.
Well, I mean, the war plan in the United States doesn't call for that. The question is, can the United States seize air superiority over a big chunk of Western Iran's airspace? And I think the answer is yes, we can. Can we sustain that for a limited period of time? And while we're doing that, how many ballistic missiles is Iran going to be able to launch? No mass launches, because you'll all be killed before you launch. You'll get some leakers out there. That's the American plan. Maybe the Iranians have a secret air defense capability that, is we haven't bet on, and we go in there. Next thing you know, we're getting locked on. We lost too many aircraft. We have to pull back and change our tactics. Now the airspace is open and the missiles are flying, and Iran has turned the tables on us. But there's no guaranteed outcome. And again, the American military believes that they will be able to suppress Iran's ballistic missile launch capability. They just won't be able to sustain that suppression. Iran, there's, yeah, I think, there are observers there, learning, um, and all that, but bringing it back and translating it into, you know, real action. I don't know enough about the Iranian military to know whether or not the observations of Iranian observers come back. Are they brought to the Iranian military command, to the university, and said, turn this into doctrine? Or do they come back and get into discussion groups that lead to, subcommittees talking about this, that, and the other thing? How is Iran integrating drone warfare at the tactical level? Are they replicating the Russian model precisely, or are they saying, we'll have some guys studying it, but we're not going to do the big transformation? I don't know. I don't know enough about how Iran works to be able to answer that question. I do know that the Russians have slowly but surely turned their military into one of the most responsive professional learning institutions in the world. That as a lesson is developed at the front line, there's now a mechanism for not just the lesson, but the people who learn that lesson to be pulled out, plugged into the education system, and have rapid evaluation and have it turned into doctrine or training packets that's then fed down so that as soon as possible after the lesson was learned, it's being taught to people within a context that's applicable to the battlefield. I don't think Iran has that right now. So I don't think the Iranian military is totally transformed into an analog of the Russian military. It's the Iranian military with its own strengths and weaknesses. The Ukrainian military has done a very good job of adaptation. I mean, we only have to look at the most recent NATO exercise in, what was it, Estonia, Hedgehog 25, where a couple small units of Ukrainian drone operators basically brought the entire NATO force to a standstill because NATO doesn't know how to fight drone war. But I will say this, that the United States wasn't involved in that. And the United States is a different military than any other military out there. I didn't say better, I said different. And if you think that a bunch of drone operators are going to stop a United States armored division from advancing, then you don't know anything about how the United States operates. Because we will just rain down firepower on the drone. It has to be backed up by a lot more than that. Then it can't just be a bunch of drone units doing hit and run, because we'll just dismount infantry, go in and kill them all with bayonets. We're not Europe. We love to fight. And, so I'm a little hesitant about embracing too wildly the Hedgehog 25 outcome because the United States wasn't involved. It doesn't mean that it would have been different. I would have just liked to see the American response to the Ukrainian hit and run drones, see how well it worked. But there's no doubt that the Russians and Ukrainians are fighting war on a level that nobody else understands and comprehends. The North Koreans were there. They learned a lot. They adapted. We still don't know the full extent of their involvement. Was it some special forces that did some reconnaissance fighting, backed up by North Korean artillery, which it seems to be the case, or was there, conventional infantry units that were also, getting dirty and learning tactics, how to advance? Because by the time the North Koreans got involved, it was already a drone war. So you had to adapt to the reality of drone warfare. And, did they work with the Russians? Did they have Russian teams supporting them? Did their own drone teams? How did they, integrate those lessons of the battlefield into doctrine, et cetera? These are all fair questions. You're muted.
Oh, sorry, Scott. The conflict in Ukraine is getting somehow crazy when you look at what is happening in Europe, because they're talking about sending nukes in Ukraine. And what is how let me ask the first question that I asked you when we started this talk. It is the foreign policy of Donald Trump in Ukraine. It's somehow so much confusing. And what is the perception of the Russians, in your opinion, of what Donald Trump is doing?
I think the Russian government has embraced the concept of the spirit of anchorage. And they believe, although Sergei Lavrov recently said that there is no spirit of anchorage, that the United States has not followed through, but I still think the Russian government operates on the hope that they can get the Americans back on to a track that follows along those lines. I'm not privy to the conversations that Steve Witkoff has with Kirill Dmitriev, or the conversations that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have with President Putin, or the conversations they have with President Trump when they come home. No one is privy who has gone public. So I don't know what is being said. What I do know, though, is that major players in the U.S. government are operating as if there is no spirit of anchorage. Mm. Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, whom Donald Trump just, heaps praise after praise after praise, continues to seek to collapse the Russian economy and bring Russia to its knees through economic sanctions. That's not the spirit of Alaska. John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, is trying to assassinate the Russian president. That's not the spirit of Alaska, of anchorage. The United States is providing targeting intelligence to a British-made drone, the FP-5 Flamingo, that's provided to the Ukrainians, that just struck Votkinsk machine building plant, one of the most sensitive and important defense industrial facilities in all of Russia. That triggers the Russian nuclear doctrine, by the way, and that's not much of a spirit of anchorage. So, again, the president might, in his heart of hearts, want peace. But, again, the whole mantra of peace through strength, it's counterproductive, countervailing. It doesn't make any sense. Because the strength that the president's flexing, sanctions, CIA assassination, and critical infrastructure targeting, is so far removed from the notion of the kind of mutual trust that's necessary to negotiate a lasting peace. There's no reason for Russia to trust anything that Donald Trump says nowadays or does. I mean, his track record is not good. What he did to the Iranians in June, what it appears he might be getting ready to do to Iran again, doesn't create the impression of a honest and trustworthy, negotiating partner. So I don't think the Russians are naive. I think the Russians are confused by the mixed signals you get, because again, either Donald Trump is a psychopathic liar. So he's capable of telling Putin one thing and telling his cabinet members another thing, and is secretly giggling at the prospects of an expanded conflict. Or he's just a dilettante who's stuck his foot in waters that he doesn't know how to navigate. And I think it's the latter. I think that if you asked him, he could honestly say, I want peace with Russia, and that he may have directed Witkoff and Kushner to engage in certain conversations, but he's also bought into this peace through strength, model of operation. And so, he has other people out there who don't want peace with Russia. Scott Bessent, John Radcliffe, and others who are looking to bring Russia down. That's the strength aspect of it. And this president...
Why is that, Scott? Where does it come from? What are they gaining from that? Are they literally concerned about the kickbacks, or was something like that? Or what is the ideology under part?
Well, it's a sustainment of ideology that's been in place since 1940 47, 48. I mean, people need, I know you're running out of time. Just give me a couple minutes because I'm going to go into a little bit of a history lesson here. Go back and study, the Galen organization. American real denazification efforts weren't real. We whitewashed the general staff. The whole resurrection of or denazification of Nazis so that they could serve in the German government, serve in the new Bundeswehr. And then the role that was played by Galen and others in using Ukraine, amongst others. We used the Baltic states and Poland as well. But Ukraine was a tool of destabilization. The CIA, when it was created, started a project, Aerodynamic, I think it was. Inside Aerodynamic was a project called Red Sox. Red Sox was the training of Ukrainian nationalists in the control of the West to be parachuted back into Western Ukraine to meet up with partisans for the purpose of expanding the resistance movement against the Soviet Union. Ukraine has always been seen as a point of leverage against the Soviet Union and later Russia. And the fact that we allowed Ukrainians to be sacrificed is beyond the point. But, they lost that war. 1953, 1954, the Bandera organization, Ukrainian nationalists, was routed. Hundreds of thousands fled Ukraine to the West. Many of them came here in the United States, formed a pro-Bandera diaspora. But others were arrested and sent to Soviet penal colonies as prisoners. But then Nikita Khrushchev came and liberated them, called them political prisoners. They were part of the, Stalin is bad, so anybody who got imprisoned under Stalin is a political prisoner. No, these were evil Banderas who were responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Soviet security forces, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians. But they were freed from prison and came back to Ukraine. And even though the CIA was no longer parachuting operatives in, we now had a diaspora that was, politically inclined to broadcast propaganda, publish newspapers, the whole work. And they created cells inside of Ukraine to meet these former Banderas coming out of the prison and get them reinsinuated back into society. So the Banderas now were able to get jobs, not just in Ukraine, but in the Soviet Union. They could go travel to Russia and get jobs. That's why throughout Russia today, you keep seeing these pro-Ukrainian cells show up because they've always been Banderists, and the CIA has always been paying them. And you can study that. You can study the CIA projects that were being done in New York City, in Europe, and elsewhere in support of Ukrainian nationalism. In the 1950s, the United States Army Special Forces talked about parachuting into Western Ukraine to meet up with indigenous forces politically sympathetic to the Western cause and create, armies of resistance to disrupt the rear area operations of the Soviet Union and to break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. This has always been the plan of the United States. It's always been the plan of the United States. We funded these people. The CIA funded it up until 1990. I think Project Aerodynamic didn't end until 1990. After that, the money transferred from the CIA to the National Endowment for Democracy that used other non-governmental organizations to, again, empower these nationalists. If you think 2004 happened in a vacuum, you know nothing. 2004 was the empowerment of Ukrainian nationalists through CIA money or NED money. And that's how you got, I think, Yulia Tymoshenko to become prime minister or president. That Viktor Yanukovych, who won the election. Not
you mean 2014?
No, I mean 20. No.
2004? Yeah. Before.
Not the Rose was Georgia. The Orange Revolution, I think they called it.
Orange Revolution. Exactly. It was
CIA backed, CIA funded. 100% CIA working with the same people they've been working with since 1947. All right. This didn't just happen overnight. This is a decades-long operation to have the nationalists use Ukraine as a fist against Russia or the Soviet Union. 2004 was to empower the nationalists. What's the first thing Yushchenko did when he became president? Make Stepan Bandera the national hero of Ukraine. Okay, you see this? Viktor Yanukovych, the Russian-speaking president, they threw him out after an illegal, unconstitutional third round of balloting. But he came back in 2010 and won because of the incompetence of these nationalists. But that's when the CIA made the decision that we can't allow this to happen. And so they set up 2014, the Maidan. The Maidan was a CIA operation to permanently disable the political viability of Ukraine's Russian-speaking population. It wasn't just about getting rid of Yanukovych. It was about building up the nationalists and suppressing once and for all the totality of the Russian-speaking presence in Ukraine. This is why Azov went to Mariupol and literally raped that city. They were Kharkov, football gangsters backed up by some Western Ukrainian thugs who went in and seized the city of Mariupol, which is right on the Sea of Azov. They call themselves Azov because that's where they built their headquarters, their Nazi headquarters that was literally in play up until the Russians liberated that city in 2022. But in the West, we pretend none of this happened. We pretend that none of these nationalists exist. We pretend that the CIA didn't have any connectivity to these people. How do you think the CIA? I mean, it's funny to watch, Zelensky speak from the bunker. This is the bunker where I said, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition, and created the legend. But we know he never said that. We know that the CIA is the one who planted that story in. It's a matter of fiction because at the time he was supposed to have said that, he was pooping his pants, running around trying to get guarantees that Putin wouldn't kill him. Feared for his life. And the CIA admits, yeah, we said it. Go read the Washington Post stories at the time where you get to the actual source of the statement. Zelensky never uttered those words. Those words were put into the public as if they were spoken by Zelensky, but the CIA says, we sort of made those words up. That's the reality of the hero there. It's all fiction. It's all nonsense. But the point is, if you think that this war just happened because of irresponsible Russian actions, you know nothing about history. The West has been seeking to transform Ukraine into a mailed fist in the stomach of Russia since 1947. And, if you go back to December of 2021, the Russians put out 2 draft treaties saying, how they can be looking for a new European security framework. Embedded in each of these treaties, one to the U.S., one to NATO, were articles, Article 6 in the American Treaty, Article 5 in the NATO Treaty, that sought to prohibit the deployment of intermediate range and short range missiles of one party on the soil of another that threaten the, targets of another party to the conflict. And this was further articulated between Putin and Biden as no Western missiles allowed on Ukrainian soil. Russia said that's very important to us. No, we can't have long-range strike capability resident on Ukrainian soil as a neutral country. Can't happen. If that's what you want, this will be war. And the United States refused to negotiate on that. And so then the war starts, and we start providing them with Scalp missiles from France, Storm Shadow from England, 250-kilometer range, ATACMS from the United States, 300-kilometer range. But because of the Russian opposition, we limited Ukraine's ability to use these weapons to targets that were within the, post-2014 borders, meaning they could strike Crimea, they could strike Novorossiya, the Donbass, Zaporizhia, Kherson, but you can't strike Russia. And when the United States and Great Britain sought to lift the restrictions on ATACMS and Storm Shadow, the Russians responded by threatening nuclear war. And then when Trump threatened to send in Tomahawk missiles, Russia did the same. And so they didn't do that. But what happened just the other day? An FP-5 Flamingo was fired by Ukraine and struck Votkins. This is the exact reason why Russia never wanted any of these missiles to be stationed in Ukraine. It happened to avoid this very thing. And the FP-5 is not a Ukrainian missile. It's a British missile, designed by a British company, produced by the British, assembled by the Ukrainians to give it that ostensible Ukrainian smell. But it's literally a Western long-range cruise missile stationed on Ukrainian soil, striking strategic targets in the interior of Russia. you can make the argument that Russia's already lost this war, because if that was one of the main things they're trying to prevent, they done failed. But what it really means is now that this war will not end until Russia can guarantee that the Flamingo or any missile like that will never again appear on Ukraine's soil. It changes the whole concept of what peace will look like. So there we are.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Scott, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
All right, thanks. I apologize. I'm fighting a cold. I had to go dig my car out of the snow before this show, and I got stuck in a snowdrift, and so I'm literally a frozen block of ice right now, and I'll probably die as soon as we get off the air. But thanks for having me on.
See you soon, Scott. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.